Hello, and welcome to Matter of Mind. This is my first video. I have been a longtime listener and reader of content regarding philosophy, metaphysics, and God, and I feel that now is my time to join the discussion. What spurred me to make this channel and this video was the recent panel hosted by Premier Unbelievable that included William Lane Craig, Philip Goff, Jessica Frazier, and Joe Foley. I'll put the link in the description, as well as Alex O'Connor's interview of Bernardo Kastrup, which I'll also link in the description. These were good discussions, but I didn't think that they did quite as much with the metaphysical discussion as they could have or should have. So I wanted to make this video as a response to those and to the general discussions taking place around idealism, materialism, and God. I find that many people on both sides of the theism debate present God as a noun, some sort of super object, a supreme cosmic being existing separately from the universe. I actually think William Lane Craig falls into this trap, and it's unfortunate that this panel did not have a classical theist on who could bring a different and more accurate notion of God. Philip Goff, on the other hand, has a conception of God that sits in between traditional Christianity, Eastern religions, and some sort of idealism or panpsychism. But I don't think that Philip has quite put the puzzle pieces together yet. I think he's on his way and he's doing it, and he's pushing the conversation into the right direction. So, about me, real quick, I'm an amateur when it comes to philosophy and this sort of thing. But I've been watching these conversations develop over the years, and it's one of my hobbies. And I developed my own views privately, and now I'm seeing some of these online conversations align with some of the views that I've developed. So I thought that it would be helpful to add my voice as well. The best way to describe my views is that I believe in the panentheistic God of classical theism. That is, God is not a being, but God is being itself. Being is a verb, not a noun. It's an activity. God is the underlying activity of existence. This tracks with Thomas Aquinas and some modern Thomists like W. Norris Clarke. However, I will say that much of Thomism misses the mark about what was truly important in Aquinas' work. W. Norris Clarke did a fantastic job of reaching back to Aquinas to represent what Aquinas really meant by God and how radical that is. So, what I'm going to talk about is not a wholly new idea. Aquinas did it pretty well many centuries ago, and um, obviously, some people over the centuries have gotten that and what he really meant. However, I think overall we have not really truly understood or grasped what Aquinas meant by God and the implications of that. And I think that Thomism, unfortunately, is pretty locked into its own language, its own world, and I have yet to see a Thomist successfully bridge the gap to some of these other ideas. And I think the problem with Thomism is they get so locked into their own terminology that it's hard to have a real conversation and figure out what they mean when you apply it to actual lived reality. For example, just figuring out what is meant by substance and form um, can be very difficult. And I think a lot of Thomists don't really understand what they're saying when it's taken outside of the context of their own linguistic framework. But, anyways, what we need to do is translate Thomism into terminology that takes into account consciousness and modern discussions. And so, where I think this Thomistic notion of God as active being gets really interesting is when you pair it with more recent ideas concerning consciousness and idealism. So, to start this discussion, let's think about Kant's distinction between the phenomena and the noumena. So, for those that don't know, phenomena is what we experience. and the noumena is the underlying reality as it exists in itself. According to Kant, the noumena is totally unknown and unreachable by humans because we only ever experience phenomena, and our phenomena are necessarily filtered through our senses. So, under that view, what can we even truly say about the underlying reality? It almost seems like philosophy is at a dead end at that point. However, following Kant, Arthur Schopenhauer famously declared that there is a narrow singular window into the noumena, and that is our own experience. We exist, and we directly know what it is like to exist. Now, we use various terms to describe it. We might call it spirit or consciousness or awareness, subjective experience. But the important point is that not only do we know a piece of the noumenal realm, but we actually are a piece of the noumenal realm. That means that whatever else we cannot say about existence, we can at least say that existence includes consciousness. And as Schopenhauer pointed out, we are represented in the phenomenal world as physical matter. And so not just represented, but represented. So our mind is taking in that noumenal data and turning it into a mental experience that is our phenomena. But still, we experience that noumenal reality of existence. And because we have an what you might call external physical representation of ourself, right? We have an inner experience of our body, but we have a body that is in the external quote unquote physical world. It's reasonable and parsimonious to infer that all other physical matter is a representation of an underlying noumenal reality that is akin to our own. That is, we can reasonably infer that all existence is conscious experience. And of course, that conscious experience won't be the same as a human conscious experience, but it's reasonable to think that it is something similar to it, some sort of subjective experience of mind or awareness, whatever you want to call it. And so this is really kind of an idealism view of the world. And some people might take that in a panpsychism direction, but what we're not saying is that every rock or every piece of sand is a self aware entity. What we're saying is that reality is fundamentally consciousness, and we happen to be a form of consciousness that is self aware. Now, we also know that existence is animated, it changes. There is some impetus within existence that moves it, but no finite part of existence can account for the animation of the whole of existence, right? And so this tracks with the arguments by Aquinas, his famous five ways, arguments from change. So whatever principle animates existence must transcend any particular form of existence, because any particular form of existence will be a finite segment of existence and can't account for the rest of existence. So something has to account for the entirety of the animation of existence. And the problem is, existence is all encompassing. So, in this sense, I am a naturalist. There's nothing that exists outside of existence. Whatever is, and whatever is not, is not. So, there can be nothing external to existence to account for the animation of existence. Therefore, we know that existence must be self animating. And this animating principle, it is within existence. And it is self moving, self actualizing, self animating. And it's unlimited because there are no external limits to it. And so this is God. This is the God of classical theism. God is the mysterious principle, you could say, within existence that is unlimited and self actualizing. And this right here is the key, because by following this framework, we can now say that existence is self actualizing, unlimited, and must at least be conscious. And this is where we can bridge the gap between naturalism and theism, because there actually is no divide. We don't need to solve the problem, we simply dissolve the problem. Naturalists say that all that exists is all there is, and they are correct. But existence is not made up of separate platonic objects floating independently in space bumping into each other, right? Like atomism is not valid. Yet that's how a lot of people think about the world. Existence is actually an activity, and this activity is what God truly means in the classical traditional sense of the word. So God is not a sky wizard or a supreme being. God is transcendental existence, which means that God is inside of all existence at the fundamental level, including you and me. And because existence is not externally limited, anything that exists purely because existence freely wills it to exist. So, this is what Christianity calls the loving God, because existence wants us to exist. Otherwise, we wouldn't exist. So, at its core, Christianity is a radical movement of gratitude for mere existence. Because once you take existence for granted, you lose your place in the order of being, and it leads to suffering. So you have to remember where you are, and that existence is a gift, and you have to take on an attitude of gratitude. But to return to the topic of the video, Philip Goff, I think, is actually very nearly there. I believe he's joined the Anglican Church, and he's trying to find a way to bridge these ideas and put them together. And so I think what he's doing is fantastic, although I think that he's maybe struggling a bit, and I think he hasn't really discovered the classical theism missing piece. And part of the video or part of that panel discussion that really illustrates where people are talking past each other is where Craig and Goff discuss the Venn diagram. And to William Lane Craig, there can be no Venn diagram between God and existence because to him, God is wholly separate from existence. Now, Philip Goff, somewhat clumsily, I think, tried to illustrate that God is within existence with the Venn diagram. I don't think that the Venn diagram was the greatest example, but then again, how could you possibly really show it? But I think that a more accurate Venn diagram would be to have a circle on the bottom, which is raw, pure existence, the activity of existence, that's God. And then above it is another circle, right on top of it, really superimposed, right? They're really not separate at all. And the circle on top of it would be the forms of existence. So that's everything that we perceive as different forms, including ourselves. So you have the forms, and then really within the forms, you have raw existence moving them, animating them from within. So I think Goff is on the right track, and the fact that Craig thinks that this is some sort of paradox simply shows that he has an incorrect conception of God. Now, for the mystical experiences described by Goff, where his egoic self is stripped away, and then a person experiences some altered consciousness, I don't think it's an insignificant data point. Now, I would not say that people having those types of experiences are entering some other dimension or realm or having a spiritual experience somehow outside of themselves, because I think that it is the brain being affected by whatever substance is affecting it. But I believe that they are having a spiritual experience, only that spiritual experience is inside of themselves. It's going deeper, and they are experiencing a different type of existence, not one, again, outside of themselves, but within. It's an experience that does not have the egoic scaffolding that is created by our mind, right? So most people don't even realize it because you're so in your own experience, but we take our perceptions for granted, and really our mind is actively constructing the world around us that we experience. And this is pretty strange to think about and hard to envision if you've never experienced it, but it can be escaped to a certain degree by meditation techniques or mind altering substances that kind of tear away that egoic scaffolding. And so it's not as though an experience like that gives you full access to the infinite consciousness of God or anything like that, because you're still within your finite self. But I do think that it can bring you closer to the raw ground of existence that is within us. So it's an interesting data point and it fits within this framework, but I don't think it's the be all end all of these discussions. And I think when people put too much emphasis on it, it naturally kind of makes people skeptical and pushes them away. It makes it sound a little woo woo and a little bit out there, but I do think it tracks this framework. Now, I also think that Goff gets it wrong when he posits that God is limited in power. God cannot be limited in any way because God is the act of existence itself, the ultimate foundation for all existence. This must be completely unlimited and infinite. And so I understand the intuition from the suffering argument, right? How could God create a world with suffering? That means God must be limited in some way. But that's really a human perspective, very limited perspective. And as brilliantly illustrated in the book of Job, it's really not our place to understand why. And I know that sounds like a cop out, and I get that it's deeply unsatisfying to our thirst for knowledge, but we have to accept that we are finite in nature, and we simply don't know or can't know why existence willed itself to be the way that it is. But what we do know is that existence, or God, willed us into existence. And so personally, I choose by faith to take on that attitude of gratitude for mere existence. And so to put it a little more analytically, if God is limited, then God has unactualized potential. And so if God has potential that is not actualized, then God is contingent, which means God requires a higher prior actualizer to explain why God has these limits rather than those limits. And so a limited God is not and cannot be the ultimate reality. It can't be God. It would just be another object inside of existence. And so that can't be the case. So God is whatever is the fundamental principle at the rock bottom of existence. And so if we stop viewing God as an item in the universe, as some sort of distant and distinct noun, and start recognizing God as the unlimited, self-actualizing verb in which all reality participates, then the apparent divide between classical theism, panpsychism, idealism, and Eastern non-duality, it disappears. And on that point, it actually brings to mind Bernardo Kastrup, who has arrived at a similar conclusion, but I don't think that he has realized yet that he's arrived at the same conclusion. Kastrup calls himself a naturalist, and so he kind of falls into that false divide that I'm talking about, because that implies that there's some difference between theism and naturalism when really there's not. And Kastrup says that existence does what it does because it is what it is, and that is God. God does what it does because it is what it is. And so if Kastrup is saying that nature is somehow limited by an externality, then something must account for that externality. And if there's no externality and it's just is self-actualizing, then that would be God. So at the end of the day, no matter how you slice it, existence must bottom out at a self-actualizing principle. And no matter what you call it, that is God. And so that's really just all that I wanted to say, and maybe hopefully kick off more of a discussion of bringing some of these ideas together. I think that Bernardo Kastrup, Philip Goff, they really are pushing these ideas in a good direction, and I think somebody has to make that bridge to classical theism. And so I want to be a part of that discussion if I can. And so, Philip, if this video finds its way to you, I think your journey toward Anglicanism and your work on these topics is really pushing Western philosophy in a vital direction. But I don't think that we need to settle for a limited God. And Bernardo, I love what you're doing as well, but I don't think you need to be afraid of the religion label or afraid of entering into the God territory. Right. I don't think we need to choose between theism and naturalism or theism and non dual consciousness. And also on the topic of um, thinkers in this area, it's interesting watching the development of Alex O'Connor because I think I sense that he's slowly moving in this direction. Although I think he's just kind of dipping his toes in, and I think that he is, he lives up to that skeptic label. So it'll be interesting to see where Alex goes, but I can kind of see him moving this direction. And overall, I kind of feel an undercurrent moving in this direction. And so I really want to be a part of this conversation as it develops. So I would love to discuss these ideas further with any of the aforementioned thinkers or anyone else. I don't think anyone has quite put the puzzle pieces together yet. And I'm not saying that I have all the answers, but I think there is a trend in the right direction, and I think that I could really help pull the conversation in that direction. So I hope to make more videos on these topics in the future. If anyone would like to discuss with me, please feel free to reach out, or of course leave a comment, and I'd love to chat with you. All right, thanks everyone.